The file was 31 years old, and no one had ever read it in its entirety. It lay in the central archive of the Hegemony, a vast, cold place where 700 years of records and expansion were stored in long, crystalline shelves, marked as low priority, meant only for monitoring and designated with standard nomenclature assigned to species not yet worth worrying about. The species in question called themselves humans. A Hegemony research team had discovered them much like one finds an anthill by the roadside. Noted, catalogued, moved on. The initial report consisted of 12 pages. Most of it was dedicated to biology. The biology was unimpressive. Soft bodies without natural armor, limited sensory range, a lifespan barely exceeding a century if nothing went wrong. Their technology lagged roughly 300 years behind the galactic average. They had managed to put a few stations into orbit around their home planet and were making early claims regarding their nearest moon. Their homeworld had one large ocean, which they called by different names depending on which part of it they were looking at, as if a single body of water required 7 different titles. This detail landed in the report under the heading Indicators of Cultural and Rationality, Class 3, Developing Species. The file stated pre-warp, tribal, biologically fragile. Then, at the bottom of the first page in a section marked Additional Observations, someone had written, exhibits characteristic victim species behavior of inflating threats, consistent with social hierarchies. In the margins next to this line, written in an alphabet the archivists labeled as unidentified, were 2 small words. No one read them. The file was closed. Humans were added to a watch list and forgotten, the way things are forgotten when no one expects them to matter. 31 years later, Ambassador General Eva Salanova stood behind the central podium of the all-galactic Diet, reporting to the gathered powers of the known galaxy exactly what Earth wanted them to know. Not everything she wanted them to know. The Diet was built for grand purposes, and the room understood that. The ceiling curved upward in a way that made everyone inside feel equally small, a diplomatic trick as old as architecture, which had stopped working on Eva around her 7th year. Representatives of 43 species sat in their sections, in chairs, cradles, liquid tanks, and hanging filaments, depending on what their bodies required. Light came from everywhere at once, and cast no shadows, which Eva always found troubling in a way she couldn't fully describe. The air was calibrated every 8 minutes to accommodate the competing atmospheric needs of the room. The result was a smell that resembled nothing else, which was worse than smelling like something bad. She was 54 years old. She had held this specific job for 12 years, and before that, she had spent 19 years doing adjacent work in smaller rooms with smaller stakes. She had a face that gave nothing away, not trained impassivity, but simply the natural result of keeping score for a very long time in a game where revealing your cards cost lives. Her hair had gone gray at 40, and she let it be, because she had more pressing decisions. She read from the documents regarding Earth's capabilities in the disclosed volume. 38 registered classes of warships, active fleet counts by category, defensive installation data for all labeled systems, weapon systems listed by range, power, and delivery mechanism, all of it formatted according to the standard disclosure template of the Galactic Diet, all of it technically accurate, all of it presented within the framework of Earth's voluntary compliance with interstellar transparency agreements that every species signed and no one fully observed, which was simply the understood nature of such agreements. The High Choir of Velis from the Hegemony section processed the disclosure with its 11 minds working in fluid consensus. Bioluminescent patterns moved beneath the surface of its body. Pale green and cool blue waves shifted slowly and deliberately. It was the equivalent of a calm, closed expression for a Velshar. The Hegemony had consumed 9 species over the last 2 centuries. It knew what a developing army looked like. It knew what mid-level capabilities sounded like when read aloud. This sounded exactly like that a known quantity doing its paperwork. Eva watched as Velis processed the numbers. She watched the bioluminescence remain calm and blue. She noticed 3 delegates from minor species already half-turned toward their aides, losing interest. She noticed 2 representatives of the Confederacy who had brought tablets and were reading something else entirely beneath the edge of the table. She said nothing about the other numbers, the ones that hadn't been in the document, the ones that had been growing for 20 years in facilities registered under civil infrastructure classifications across 17 categories that had no names in the treaties. Because no one had thought to name them. Why name a weapons category if no treaty requires you to declare it? If what you are building is something no one has yet thought to forbid? She closed the document when she reached the last disclosed line. "We hope the Diet finds this disclosure satisfactory," she said. Her voice had the specific quality of a person who had stopped feigning reassurance and was simply delivering it. Like a doctor reporting a prognosis they had given 100 times. Velez expressed satisfaction. The other delegates accepted the disclosure without incident. The session moved to other business. At the very end of the document Eva presented, on page 41, in a section titled Additional Notes, which delegates traditionally skipped as it contained acknowledgments, formatting, and citation indices, were 3 paragraphs. They were clear, they were precise, they used the simplest language possible. They stated, without drama and without apology, that Earth's disclosed capabilities represented a voluntarily limited operational posture, that the full posture had not been demonstrated and would not be demonstrated except under conditions that Earth defined, specifically with a numbered list of definitions as existential provocation, and that any party reading the document should consider itself officially notified of these conditions, these definitions, and the fact of the limitation. Velez skipped page 41. Every delegate skipped page 41. Eva had written it knowing they would. She submitted it anyway because the submission was what mattered. Because when everything else was done, the record would show that notification had been given, and the choice to skip it was made by someone else. The following years had a shape, if you were a person who stepped back far enough to see it. 4 years after the disclosure, a Confederacy of Chi reconnaissance fleet crossed space labeled by Earth near an outer transit corridor. It was a test. The Chi ran tests the way some species run constantly, automatically, mostly to collect data. They wanted to know response times, fleet deployment speeds, and communication latency between Earth's outer stations and Central Command. Earth responded in 11 minutes. One ship exited the transit corridor, stood alongside the reconnaissance fleet of 14 vessels, and held position. Weapons were not charged, there were no aggressive signals. It remained there for 6 hours while the Chi conducted their scans, and the commander of the reconnaissance fleet sent increasingly puzzled reports back to the Confederacy Command. Then, the Earth ship transmitted what? Not a warning, not a military demand, but a letter written by 1-2-year-old Nastya Petrova, who lived in the Kepler Outer Colony System. She had won the school diplomatic writing contest for 7.3 years in a row. The letter expressed Earth's sincere hope for the well-being of the Chi Confederacy. In polite and neat language, it noted that this region of space was under Earth's administrative designation and asked with sincere politeness whether the Chi fleet needed anything before continuing its journey. The reconnaissance fleet left. The Chi recorded the incident as a non-aggressive, limited capability response. They noted the deployment of a single ship and the transmission of a letter written by a child. They reasonably concluded that Earth's outer system response forces did not pose a serious strategic threat. They were right about the letter. It was sent because Eva's predecessor believed, with that conviction that needs no explanation, that a letter should always be first. They were wrong about almost everything else. What they didn't record, because they didn't know what to look for, was what was in the transit corridor behind the Earth ship. In the shadow of a navigational dead zone at the edge of the reconnaissance fleet's sensor range, 11 ships were running in dark mode with signatures that the equipment read as background radiation. They had moved into position in 4 minutes. The remaining 7 minutes were travel time for the ship with the letter. The Chi never found out. They filed their report and moved on. And the gap in their knowledge remained there, unrecorded, unnoticed, growing in the dark. 11 years later, galactic arms reduction agreements were passed by full vote. Earth officially requested an exemption. The request was denied in committee before it reached the floor. Earth argued that the agreements, as written, created an asymmetric risk for species at active stages of development. The committee found this argument self-serving. They weren't wrong, they just didn't wonder if it was also true. Earth signed the agreement. Eva's predecessor signed them with a pen that had belonged to a general who had fought in the last war Earth had ever waged with itself. It was a personal detail she shared with no one, because it was something people either understood immediately or didn't understand at all, and she didn't have the patience to explain it in that room. Earth signed the agreement, and then continued its development programs in the 17 unnamed categories, because the agreement specified weapon types by name and Earth's programs did not fall into those types. 4 separate legal groups reviewed it. An external counsel from a neutral species reviewed it independently. All 4 arrived at one word: legal. Not a violation, not a loophole. It was the gap that opens when humans write rules to cover what they know and don't think to cover what they haven't yet imagined. Earth found the gap, walked into it quietly, and built within it for 2 decades. 8 years later, the Hegemony's expansion fleet passed through the Rati system. Earth had labeled Rati as a protected zone in its documents filed with the Galactic Diet 7 years earlier. The designation had been seen, acknowledged, and given the weight the Hegemony gave to administrative documents of mid-level species. The weight of a formality that was never supposed to mean anything, unless someone with power decided it did. The expansion fleet consisted of 200 ships moving toward what the Hegemony classified as a consolidation operation, their word for the process of absorbing smaller systems into their administrative network. The Rati system had 2 inhabited worlds. Neither of them had been consulted about the consolidation. That was standard Hegemony practice, the kind of standard that gets written into an operational manual when no one has ever resisted hard enough to force a rewrite. Earth sent 1 ship. The expansion fleet stopped. 200 ships, 1 Earth vessel, weapons not charged, no aggressive signals, no communication other than a standard request to hold position, the one you file when you need to clear a transit corridor. The fleet held for 4 hours. Then it turned around. The Hegemony fleet commander filed a report afterward in which she noted that the lone Earth vessel had displayed what she characterized as a bluff. Classic territorial behavior of a victim species, she wrote. She recommended that future routes simply bypass Earth-labeled zones to avoid bureaucratic inconveniences. The following year, she was promoted, and the recommendation became policy. She was right that it was a demonstration. She was wrong about what exactly it was demonstrating. 1 ship had spent 4 hours conducting passive scanning of the entire expansion fleet's configuration. Charge signatures, formation patterns, communication frequencies, hull voltage readings, movement intervals. All of it was recorded, not for immediate use, but so it would be. Earth had been collecting such data for 23 years. The files were very large. 4 years after that, Earth submitted its second official warning to the Galactic Diet. It was longer than the first, more specific. It named the existence of the 17 development categories, not their contents, only that they existed, how long they had been active, and that they were not covered by any existing treaty because existing treaties didn't know how to cover them. It repeated the conditions under which Earth's full operational posture would be demonstrated, and added a sentence that hadn't been in the first warning. The sentence read, "The demonstration, if it becomes necessary, will not be calibrated for minimal impact." The warning was filed, registered. It was assigned a reference number. It was not read by anyone with the authority to act on it. In the year the Hegemony moved on the Lighten Pact, Eva Salanova authorized the evacuation of 3 outer colony systems. She did it quietly. She sent orders through civilian relocation channels and designated them as an economic migration initiative. She spread the departure schedules over 4 months so that the population movements wouldn't cluster into a pattern visible on galactic monitoring systems. She used language in the administrative documents that bureaucracies produce in such volume that no one reads it carefully. By the time the last transport lifted from the 3rd system, 4,120 people had been relocated. Afterward, she sat alone in a room where the light was dimmed and a cup of tea had gone cold on the table beside her. A secure channel to Earth's Central Command was open. The line was quiet, save for the soft background hum of operating systems. "How much longer do we have?" asked a voice. The voice was young, new to the room, in the sense that humans are newcomers when they haven't yet learned not to let a question sound like hope. Eva looked at the cold tea. "Long enough," she said, "if they are smart." She didn't say the second half of the thought, the half that had sat behind her sternum for years, in that special place where unwanted certainty lives, where the knowledge of the coming and the impossibility of stopping it yet creates a special weight that has no name. They will not be smart. She had been watching for 31 years. She knew exactly what they would do next, because she knew how the Hegemony had done it 37 times before. And she knew they never believed a warning from a species that hadn't yet shown them the reason. The problem with holding back, she realized, was that it looked like nothing, and nothing looked like weakness, and weakness looked like an opportunity. She stood up, took the cold tea, and drank it anyway. Outside the window, a transport was rising through the upper atmosphere, heading toward the resettlement coordinates, one of the last on the schedule, marked as economic. Nothing to look at. She watched it leave until it became a light, and then until even that disappeared. Then she closed the channel, collected her files, and went back to work. There was still time to do this, right? She intended to use every minute until the last, because the minute after the last would be something entirely different, something she had been preparing for and fearing with equal and specific care since the day she first read the full file, including the margin, including the 2 words in her native language that the archivists could never identify, written there 31 years ago by the woman who had trained her, who had known exactly what they were dealing with and passed the file forward, trusting that whoever came next would know what to do with it. Hold back longer. She had held back. Earth had held back. 31 years of letters written by children and 1 ship instead of 1, and warnings hidden on page 41 of documents no one read past the 3rd page. 31 years. Because what was on the other side of holding back was something she didn't want to be responsible for starting. But starting and finishing are different things. She had always clearly understood that. The Hegemony's message came on Tuesday. Earth had a mutual defense treaty with the Lighten Pact. A non-famous treaty, not one that appeared in the summaries of galactic news services when they needed to fill the airwaves. It had been signed 14 years ago in a small, poorly lit room, and its witnesses were 3 people, 2 of whom were now retired. It wasn't famous because the Lightens weren't famous. It was a quiet people living on 4 worlds near the outer edge of the Torsus corridor, growing something like wheat and creating something like music. And 14 years ago, they had very politely asked Earth if Earth would agree to sign a paper stating that Earth would notice if someone bullied them. Earth had agreed. Earth meant it when the Hegemony moved on the Lighten Pact, not with an announcement, not with a formal vote on consolidation at the Galactic Diet, but with 300 ships appearing in Lighten orbital space one morning and remaining there until the Lighten government signed a consolidation agreement. They were not offered an option to refuse. Earth cited the treaty. The request was formal, properly formatted, and sent through proper diplomatic channels to the Hegemony administrative headquarters. The Hegemony's response took 9 days. When it arrived, it was 8 words. The Lighten Pact no longer exists. Your treaty is void. Eva read it twice. Then she placed it on the table and spent some time looking out the window at the sky over the city, saying nothing. Then she took her folders and told her aide to book her a seat at the emergency session of the All-Galactic Diet in a full hall, because she had something to say, and she wanted everyone in the hall to be there when she said it. Her aide looked at her face and booked the seat, without asking what she was going to say. In the full hall of the All-Galactic Diet, representatives of 61 species were sitting. Emergency sessions were rare enough that most delegates sat with the tense energy of people expecting something to happen, something interesting, something worth the interruption of their schedules. Eva walked in, placed the document on the podium, and looked out over the hall. Velas was in the center of the deliberative mass. 11 minds rotated in their consensus patterns in smooth, intertwining waves. The bioluminescence was calm, cool blue, slowly turning green. The Velshar expression for a situation already understood, already classified, already filed under known outcomes. Other delegates were settling in, finding their seats, talking to their aides. The Ki representatives had brought their tablets again. 2 Sarvian delegates were eating something that smelled like iron. The hall was filled with the feeling of theater before the lights go down, full of motion that hadn't yet found its cause. Eva waited for them to quiet down. Then she opened her document and read the 3rd warning aloud. Not summaries, not highlights, but every word, every clause. She read the section that named the 17 development categories and outlined what those categories contained. She read the section on timelines. How long each program had been active, how long since the first official warning, how long since the second. She read the section on the Lighten Treaty, its activation, and the 8-word response. She read the section on the operational posture, the one stating that the demonstration would not be calibrated for minimal impact, and when she reached it, she slowed down and read every word with a slight pause between them. That is how you read something to someone who keeps insisting they don't understand what you are saying. She read the final paragraph, which stated, "Only Earth considers this notice complete, and its obligations under transparency agreements fully fulfilled. What follows is no longer a function of diplomacy." She closed the document. Three things happened almost simultaneously. Two ambassadors from minor species requested an immediate recess. They did it simultaneously from opposite sides of the hall, without coordinating, which meant they had reached the same conclusion independently, which said something. The Sarvian delegates stopped eating, placed the food on the table, and did not take it again. The hall fell quiet as it hadn't been in 200 years of sessions. The impolite silence of people waiting for a speaker to finish from another species. The silence that falls when a room full of sentient beings simultaneously arrives at the same thought, and none of them wants to be the first to say it aloud. Velez broke it. 11 minds moved through their consensus patterns with the smooth confidence of a species that had already performed this calculation on 37 different species and knew how it ended. The bioluminescence remained blue, remained calm. Velez said in translation that Earth's warning was received and noted, that it conformed to the documented behavior of escalation observed in species at Earth's stage of development, that the hegemony recognized this pattern as a characteristic response to geopolitical pressure and was fully confident in the stability of the current regional order. Threatening behavior of a victim species, Velez called it. The phrase was not disparaging in tone. It was the equivalent of a clinical observation for a Velshar, like a doctor naming a symptom not to mock it but simply to classify it correctly. 11 minds had seen this before. They had seen what victim species did when they felt cornered. They had watched species 3 times larger than Earth make exactly this noise in the final stages before accepting consolidation. The noise never meant what it seemed. It always resolved the same way. Eva looked at Velez. She held that gaze for a moment that was not long by objective standards, but had a different quality than the surrounding moments. Just as certain silences have a weight that noise on either side of them lacks. She closed her folder. "Well," she said, "there it is." She took the folder, stepped down from the podium, and left the hall. Not in anger, not for show. She walked like a person who had done absolutely everything required of them, and the outcome had now passed from their hands into the hands of other people and other forces. And leaving the room was simply the logical next step. There was silence in the hall for a few seconds after the door closed behind her. Then the 2 ambassadors who had requested a recess left. Then the Sarvian delegate looked at the food he had put down, decided against it, and put it in his bag. Then the noise started again. Delegates talked to aides, filled out reaction reports, generated bureaucratic records of the session explanations that most of them were already constructing in their heads, explanations that neatly fit what had happened into something they already understood. Velez processed the session, reached consensus in 0.3 seconds, and filed it under the rubric, Known Pattern, Resolution Trajectory. It was Tuesday. The following 72 hours from Earth's side were quiet, too quiet. Velez noticed this on the second day. Not immediately. It had other issues requiring consensus. The hegemony's expansion through the Torsus corridor was ahead of schedule, and the administrative mechanism of absorbing new systems required attention. It was necessary to finalize consolidation agreements, process resource assessments, manage new population registrations. The hegemony was a large operation, and Velez was at its center. 11 minds kept everything moving in a purposeful, efficient way, the way it had moved for 4,000 years. But on the second day, one of the 11 minds noted the shape of Earth's communication silence, not the silence itself. Silences were common. Species grew quiet before important decisions, before internal political events, before seasonal changes in their administrative cycles. This silence had a different shape. Most silences had a texture. Low-level communication traffic still ran on secondary channels, administrative signals, ordinary position requests from labeled systems, the background noise that any active civilization generated simply by existing. The texture of political silence differed from the texture of a communication breakdown, which differed from the texture of deliberate operational silence. Velez's monitoring systems caught the texture of deliberate operational silence, not on military channels, but on every channel. Administrative traffic that should have been flowing between Earth's outer colonies was flowing, but thinly, reduced. Such reduction occurred when a system was carefully managed, not just working. Someone was maintaining the normal appearance of Earth's signal without generating the normal volume of noise. The 11th mind recorded this as a note, not a concern, simply a note. The other 10 minds were already moving to the next item on the agenda. Velez reached consensus in 0.3 seconds. The note was filed. The session continued. On the third day, intelligence arrived, confirming that Earth was making no defensive fleet movements, no ship redeployments, no stations brought to high alert, no changes to any registered military facilities. These were correct intelligence findings. They were accurate. Every data point was real. What the intelligence didn't catch, what it couldn't catch because it was looking for moving and changing things, was that it had already changed. It had changed months ago, before the Lighten Pact, before the Hegemony decided to consolidate the Torsus corridor, before the 8-word response, before any of that. 4,120 people had already left. The unnamed objects in the treaties had been working for 20 years. The dark ships in the transit corridors had been in position longer than the Hegemony had been watching. The third warning had been submitted. Everything that needed to be in place was in place. Earth wasn't moving because Earth had finished moving. Velas's 11 minds didn't know this. The note remained in the file. The session continued. At the 73rd hour, the Hegemony strike fleet invaded space labeled by Earth, 340 ships. The flagship was named Patient Majority, named after a Velshar philosophical concept that the greatest number of minds in agreement constitutes the correct course of action. It was a good name for a flagship. Velas had always thought so. It said something true about how the Hegemony understood itself. The target was a colony called Meridian Station, a remote settlement, civilians. Enough of a civilian population that the strike would be a message, but not large enough to be considered an atrocity by galactic legal standards. The Hegemony had conducted this operation 37 times on 37 species. One demonstration strike, targeted infrastructure, limited casualties, maximum political signal. After the strike, the affected species understood that the Hegemony's warnings were real, and their own were not, and the consolidation continued. It always worked. It worked because species, when they felt real power directed at them, re-evaluated their threat assessments. The noise they produced before the strike was replaced by the more useful noise of negotiation. The pattern had been consistent across 37 data points over 4,000 years. Velas didn't worry. On Earth, in the room where the light had been dimmed for 3 days, and the same secure channel was open and quiet most of that time, Eva Salanova received confirmation that the Hegemony fleet had crossed the line. She looked at the coordinates on the display. She looked at the time. She took a tablet and entered a 12-digit authorization code. The code had no name. It had a designation, a string of numbers and letters that referred to a specific operational file, but the file itself had a name in an old Siberian dialect that roughly translated as a phrase that wasn't really a phrase, but rather an exhale, the sound a person makes when they've been holding something very heavy for a long time and finally decide to let it go. She entered the code. She confirmed it. Then she placed the tablet on the table and leaned back in her chair, looking at the ceiling, where in the upper left corner there was a water stain she had looked at for 3 days but hadn't really seen. And now she saw it, and it looked exactly like what it was. A trace left by something that had happened long ago and hadn't been fixed because there were always more pressing matters. How long? Asked the young aide from somewhere behind her. 9 days, Eva said. Maybe less. Pause. This is the aide began. Yes, Eva said before the question could fully form. That is enough. She didn't explain what it was enough for, because explaining would have required a description of things she had carefully not described for 31 years to people who hadn't needed to know yet. The time for that had passed. What followed would describe itself. Outside the planet, everything went on as usual. Transports moved. Lights went on in the windows of thousands of buildings. Somewhere in Novosibirsk, a woman watched a transport rise through the upper atmosphere, not knowing it was the last civilian transport that would use this corridor for some time, not knowing that this evening something was different, because that was how everything was set up. The strike fleet was still moving. The code had been entered. The 31 years of holding back were exactly 31 years. Today, it ended. The landing pod smelled of recycled air and alien fear, and Dio was absolutely, completely, categorically fine. He repeated this to himself at regular intervals. That's how you repeat something until the repetition itself becomes a kind of proof. He was fine. Sergeant Denis Okonyev was fine. Sergeant Okonyev had done this 38 times in 4 different operations, and he definitely was not sitting in a landing pod with his grandmother's rosary beads wrapped around his left fist so tightly that the beads were leaving marks on his palm. Except he was doing exactly that. The beads were old, brown, wooden, worn smooth where his grandmother's fingers had worn them before him, which meant they had a specific texture, the texture of something held many times in difficult moments by people who needed something to hold on to. He hadn't used them for prayer since he was 12. He took them on every operation because his grandmother had given them to him the morning he first left, placing them in his hand without ceremony, and then immediately changing the subject. That was how she expressed almost everything important. He was holding them now, looking at the red light on the ceiling of the pod, and listening to the sounds of the other 11 soldiers breathing in the darkness around him. "Brother," said Private Esias Antigua from the seat to his right, "you're holding those beads like they owe you money." "I'm not holding anything," Deo said. Sergeant Okonyev is sitting in full tactical composure. Sergeant Okonyev is sweating through his collar. "It's the recycled air. That's not it." Deo didn't argue. He looked at the red light and thought about something else. He thought about the briefing, which had been short. Briefings were usually not short. His commander, Lieutenant Colonel Adisambekova, was not an officer of short briefings. She was someone who drew diagrams, used the whole board, had opinions on fields. This briefing had consisted of 4 sentences. The fleet is engaging. You watch from the pod. When the green light goes on, you drop. Your mission on Earth is to be a person standing on the surface. Deo waited for a 5th sentence with tactical purpose, targets, coordinates, rules of engagement. There was no 5th sentence. "What does that mean?" he said. "To be a person standing on the surface?" "It means," said Adisambekova, "that your boots on that ground are a message. That is the whole mission. You land, stand there, visible to observation systems, and don't leave until I tell you to leave. The both will be handled," she said. "That is not your part." He really wanted to ask whose part it was, whose specifically, and who would be doing the fighting, and a few more questions to which Adisambekova's facial expression made it clear there would be no helpful answers. So he led his squad to the prep bay, checked his gear, found his grandmother's beads in the front pocket of his pack where they always were, and put them on his wrist. That was 3 hours ago. The red light was still burning red. In the space above the Litan world in Oshara, the Hegemony strike fleet finished its formation for the approach. 340 ships, the flagship Patient Majority in the center. On the flanks, 2 lines of destroyers and a screen of fast interceptors moving along the outer edge of the formation. It was the exact arrangement developed over centuries of consolidation operations, tested against 37 different defensive configurations of species, and found effective against all of them. The Hegemony's tactical systems conducted a final threat assessment of Earth's registered defensive assets in the region. 38 classes of warships. The numbers matched the disclosure. The assessment took 11 seconds. Low threat, manageable collision. Proceed. The Earth ships exited the transit corridor at 3:41. They looked exactly as the assessment had predicted. The right types of hulls, registered configurations, numbers consistent with what Earth had disclosed to the Galactic Diet. Hegemony tactical officers looked at their screens and saw exactly what they expected to see, and for 4 minutes the collision developed as their model had predicted. 4 minutes. Inside the landing pod, the ship shuddered once. A long, slow vibration that passed through the hull as if something very large, very intentionally, had changed speed. Deo felt it in his molars. "That's us slowing down," said Essie beside him. "I know what it is. You got the beads out again. I didn't put them away." The red light stayed red. Deo breathed. Sergeant Okonyev breathed. They were the same person breathing, and both were doing it too fast, and the recycled air still smelled of alien fear, and now, likely, of his own, if he were being honest with himself, which he tried not to be. On the screens in the Hegemony Tactical Center at 3:45, something changed. The ships exiting the transit corridor stopped matching the assessment. They stopped matching any assessment. They had no markings on the hulls, no classification the Hegemony's systems could recognize. They ran on engine signatures, for which the detection equipment had no category. Not unknown in the sense that a new variant is unknown, but unknown in the sense that something is unknown when it should never have existed, when no one who wrote the treaty names had thought to reserve a classification for it. The Hegemony systems ran identification protocols and returned a result they hadn't returned in 4,000 years of operational history. No matches found. Not low match, not partial match, but no matches found. In the corridor were ships that didn't exist in any records the Hegemony had ever created. and they were dark and dense in a way that made the sensor screens look wrong, as if looking at something your eyes are capable of seeing, but your brain hasn't yet created the right shape for. The Hegemony fleet commander gave orders. The orders were correct. The tactical response was that of experienced military personnel facing a new threat. Redirect, reevaluate. Assume the defensive formation that has won every battle in Hegemony history. It was the right formation for enemies who were trying to win a battle. The landing pod shook again, this time harder, then a third time. Then it stopped shaking, which was somehow worse, because the ensuing silence had a quality like the silence before a very loud sound. Deo looked at the red light. The red light looked back. "Brother," he said, not to Essie, to no one specifically, just into the pod, just to have something in the air besides breathing. No one answered. The silence lasted another 11 seconds. Then the light turned green. He didn't see what happened to the fleet. The pod dropped, and the world outside the porthole was fire and motion, and the upper layers of the atmosphere in Oshara caught the light of their star in streaks of orange and gold. And he was pressed into his seat with his fist around his grandmother's beads, and his eyes were on the porthole, and his brain was doing what brains do in landing pods. Absolutely nothing useful. It was Essie who saw it first from the porthole on the other side. "Deo," she said. Her voice was an unusual shape, not frightened, not agitated, something nameless that sat between those two things and belonged to neither. "Deo, look!" He leaned over and looked through her porthole. The Hegemony fleet was falling apart. Not burning, not exploding the way things explode when hit by weapons as he understood them. Not breaking along structural lines the way ships break when subjected to excessive stress. It was falling apart at the seams in places that shouldn't have been seams. In geometries that forced his subconscious to stop processing what he saw and classify it under something else, something less difficult to perceive. The shapes the ships took as they disintegrated were not the shapes of destroyable things. They were the shapes of things he had no word for, being reconsidered as if the matter inside them had been asked a question it had never been asked, and it was in the process of answering 340 ships. He watched. He held the beads. "Brother," he said for the second time. And this time, the word came out the way it comes out when what is in front of you is real and you need someone nearby to confirm it. Look, he didn't finish. The pod entered the upper atmosphere, and the porthole turned orange, and nothing could be seen but fire. The sky in Oshara was a color between blue and green, in a specific shade found on worlds with a different atmospheric composition than Earth's. Not wrong, just shifted like a familiar song in a different key. The city near which they landed was called Ati in the Lytan language, which roughly translated as the place where two rivers decide. It was medium-sized. It had been occupied by the Hegemony for 7 months. The 7 months of occupation had left it in that specific state in which occupations leave places, mostly standing, but with the feeling of something that had been held still for a very long time against its nature. The street smelled of ozone and something sweet beneath it that Deo couldn't name. He walked with his squad in a loose formation, rifle at the ready but not raised, safety on. The mission parameters were the same as in the briefing: be visible, be human, be on the ground. He didn't know what to do with his hands. He had never had a mission where the tactical requirement was to simply exist in a place. And not knowing what to do with his hands was the most disorienting part of it. In every other deployment, his hands had a job. Now they had his rifle, which wasn't used, and each other, and his grandmother's beads, which he had wrapped around his wrist and kept touching with his thumb like one touches an aching tooth. Hegemony observation drones slowly circled overhead. The big ones, the ones designed for transmitting high-quality footage to command ships, to orbits, the ones with enough range to bounce a signal off a relay station and output clear images to a screen somewhere very far away. They were circling before the pod even landed. They were circling now. He looked up at one of them. It was about 40 meters up, moving in a slow, even arc. Its sensor array was pointed down at the street with the patient attention of something that doesn't get tired. It flew over him, and Deo followed it with his eyes. And then, without quite making a decision, he raised his hand. He waved. Not a signaling gesture, not a tactical gesture, but a gesture his grandmother made from the observation deck of Station Ladoga when passenger ships passed in the transit corridor a free movement, an open palm. That meant nothing specific except, "I see you, and I acknowledge that I see you." The kind of gesture that says, "You are not invisible to me, and I am not invisible to you." And here we both are. The drone circled, its sensors tracking him. Its video was transmitted up through the atmosphere and into relay systems, and eventually into formats he would never see. To screens very far away. He held his hand for a moment, then lowered it. "Did you just wave at an observation drone?" asked Essie from behind. Sergeant Okonyev was confirming the operational situation. Sergeant Okonyev had waved at a drone. "The situation," Deo said, responded in kind. As he watched the drone, it continued its arc. "It didn't do anything," she said. "It continued to observe," he said. "That's the same thing." He kept walking. His boots on the stone of Attiv made the same sound as always, flat, intentional, real, and he let himself focus on that for a while because it was something simple and grounded. And he had just watched 340 ships fall apart at the seams in geometries with no names, and his grandmother's beads were worn smooth in all the right places, and the sky was the wrong color, and the street smelled of ozone and something sweet. He walked. He was visible. He was a human standing on the surface. Whatever that meant, he was doing it. And somewhere in orbit, the video was being transmitted, and somewhere further than orbit, it would eventually reach the group of 11 minds that had spent 4,000 years watching species make noise before going quiet. And those minds would look at the video of a soldier on the street waving at a drone and try to relate it to something they already understood. Deo didn't know this. He just walked. The city around him was very quiet. The occupation had made it quiet, so he felt it in his chest. The special silence of a place that had held its breath for 7 months and didn't yet know it was allowed to exhale. At the end of the block, in a doorway, appeared a Lighten child, small, 5 or 6 years old, with the large, complex eyes that Lightens had, and who held himself very still when he was unsure. The child looked at Deo. Deo looked back. He raised his hand. He waved. The child looked at him for a long time with huge, motionless eyes. Then, very slowly, with the cautious intentionality of someone trying something they hadn't done before, the child raised one of his 4 arms and waved back. Deo felt something happen in his chest area that he was going to refuse to name or discuss, even with himself, because he needed to maintain his professional reputation and because this was what catches you when you're already at the limit and already holding beads that were not originally yours, and already processing a sky that was the wrong color, and 340 ships disintegrating in ways with no categories. He kept walking. His boots made their sound on the stone behind him in the relay. The recording continued to transmit up through the atmosphere, through relay stations, through long channels of light and signal that linked occupied worlds to command centers, to archival systems, to the 11-minded deliberative consciousness of the High Choir, which was very far away and which had not lost a war in 4,000 years, and which would watch this recording 11 times by the end of the next day, and for the first time in 400,000 years would not know what to do with it. Deo didn't know any of this. He thought about his grandmother. He thought he should call her when all this was over, before she heard about it in the news feeds, because she would hear about it in the news feeds, and the newsfeed version would not be calm. He thought that when he called, she would ask him 3 questions, and he would answer all 3 incorrectly, and she would sigh that special sigh that meant she knew he was lying and had decided not to insist this time. He thought that when he returned home, he would need to buy new beads because he had had her beads for 11 years, and their surface was almost worn away. And at some point, a person needed to return what they had borrowed. Even when the loan was a gift, even when returning it felt like the wrong direction, the street led to a square. He stopped in the middle of it. He stood there, on the square of a city smelling of ozone and something sweet, under a sky of the wrong color, with an observation drone slowly describing an arc overhead, and his grandmother's beads on his wrist, and his boots planted firmly on the stone. He was a human standing on the surface. He was a message. He still didn't quite understand what that message said, but whatever it said, it was being transmitted. The Hegemony hadn't lost a war in 4,000 years. This wasn't luck. It wasn't even, in a strict sense, a military achievement. It was the result of a very simple principle, applied with absolute consistency over 4,000 years of expansion. The Hegemony never engaged in battle with an enemy it hadn't already defeated in all important ways before the first shot. By the time the consolidation fleet entered a system, the outcome had already been decided on the level of mathematics, numbers, ratios, resource disparities. Shooting wasn't war. Shooting was an announcement that the war was over. The Velshar understood this just like everything else through the consensus of 11 minds, each of which processed information simultaneously. None of them could be entirely wrong, because the aggregate of 11 viewpoints smoothed out individual errors, the way a wide river smooths out the irregularities of its bed. 4,000 years proved the method's reliability. 37 species proved its reliability. Every collision, every consolidation, every demonstration strike resolved the same way because math said it would, and math never lied. In 19 days, the Hegemony lost 31 fleets. Not 31 ships, but 31 fleets. Velez received the reports the same way as all data, simultaneously across all 11 minds, processing, categorizing, and archiving them before the information fully finished transmitting. It absorbed the first 3 reports without significant consensus disruption. Anomalies happened. Equipment worked unexpectedly. These were known variables, accounted for in the Hegemony's operational models as an allowable margin of deviation. By the 7th report, the consensus took 0.9 seconds instead of 0.3. By the 15th, 4 seconds. By the 22nd, Velez stopped archiving the results under the rubric anomaly and opened a new category. It didn't yet have a name for the new category. That, in itself, was unusual enough to note. In 4,000 years of operation, every result had fit into an existing category. The categories were built on experience, and they were all-encompassing and had never required expansion. Velez expanded them to 19. The 31st report arrived. Velez processed it with 11 minds, reached consensus, and then did something it hadn't done in any collision in its entire recorded operational history. It stopped, left the consensus open, and went back to the beginning. The models were wrong. This was the first conclusion, and it wasn't difficult in itself. Models could be wrong. Models were built on available data, and available data had limitations. Any sufficiently advanced intelligence updated its models when the evidence demanded. This wasn't a failure, it was a function. The complexity lay in understanding how wrong the models were, not what they had missed in Earth's capabilities that was becoming clear from the collision reports. It was becoming clearer with each one, creating a picture that Velez's 11 minds were still assembling. What was not becoming clear, what was becoming less clear as more data arrived, was Earth's intent. The Hegemony's models were built on a fundamental assumption about why species fight. They fought for territory, resources, survival, dominance, the elimination of threats. Every species over 4,000 years of Hegemony expansion had fought for one or more of these things. And once you understood what a species was fighting for, you understood what would satisfy them. You understood the conditions that would end the war. You understood the shape of the resolution. Earth wasn't fighting for any of these things. This was the conclusion Velez arrived at on the 19th day after the 31st report, after 4 seconds of consensus instead of 0. And this was the most disorienting conclusion its 11 minds had ever reached because it had no category of precedent and no historical parallel in 4,000 years of records. Earth wasn't trying to win the collision. Earth had already won the collision. Earth was doing something entirely different. 3 reconnaissance files. Velez viewed them in order, because order was the only way to process things that didn't fit into clear parallel categories. The first was intercepted from Earth's command network on the first day of the collision, a transmission between a fleet commander and her tactical officers 15 minutes before Earth's second layer of assets became visible. The transmission was encrypted, but Hegemony intelligence had cracked Earth's standard encryption in the 3rd year of monitoring, which they considered a significant intelligence achievement and never shared, because there was no reason to share it with a species not worth worrying about. The transmission translated, "Do not destroy the ships. We want them to see the ships. We want them to be able to tell someone what they saw. Leave them whole enough that they can transmit data." Velez processed this 11 times. Each time, the same result. Earth's fleet commander, in the first minutes of a collision in which her military had deployed capabilities no other species knew about, gave an order not to destroy the enemy fleet, but to bear witness. She needed witnesses. The Hegemony battle model had no category for an enemy that wanted you to survive long enough to report what you had seen. There was no category for an army whose primary goal at the start of battle was obtaining testimony. The model assumed you won, and then told the story yourself. It didn't account for a species that wanted the other side to tell the story in their own words. based on the experience of being present. Velez held this conclusion in consensus for 7 seconds. Then it opened the second file. The second file was an evacuation order. Velez knew about the evacuations. Intelligence had flagged them, classified them as economic migration, recorded them, and moved on. What intelligence hadn't done was correlate the dates. The evacuation of Earth's outer colonies was authorized 6 months before the Hegemony moved on the Lighten Pact, not 6 months before the start of the collision, but 6 months before the Hegemony had made any decision to move on the Litan Pact, before the internal vote approving the consolidation, before the start of operational planning, before any meetings where the Hegemony had decided in private that the Torsus corridor was the next target. Earth had started evacuating its civilians before the Hegemony knew what it was going to do, which started the war. Velez processed this with 11 minds, and the consensus took 9 seconds. And when it concluded, what it produced was not a recorded conclusion, but a question which in itself was unprecedented. Because in 4,000 years of operation, the process of Velshar consensus had never generated a question it couldn't immediately answer. The question was, how? Not, how did they know? The intelligence failure was obvious and would be addressed. The question was of a different kind, the kind that lies beneath the surface of events and asks about the nature of a thing, not its mechanics. How long had Earth been watching? How long had it been preparing? How long had it been sitting with the knowledge of the coming and the possibility of responding to it, and the patience to wait until the moment was perfectly suitable? The evacuation had been authorized 6 months before the Hegemony decided to move. Earth's development programs had been active for 20 years. The first official warning had been filed 31 years ago. 31 years? Velez held this number in its 11 simultaneously working minds and felt something for which it had no word in its own language because it had never been needed. The Velshar had words for confidence stemming from numerical superiority, words for the satisfaction of completed consolidation, words for the fluid confidence of a consensus reached by 11 minds without deviation. It had no word for that specific sensation when you first realize that something patient has been watching you longer than you yourself have been watching it. It opened the third file. The recording lasted 47 seconds. A view from Earth from an observation drone in low orbit over the third largest city in Oshara. The drone had been transmitting the image continuously even before the landing pods landed. The recording was clear, high resolution, stable, well lit by the local star standard operational observation. Velez had viewed thousands of hours of similar recordings from 37 different consolidation operations. The first 40 seconds showed streets, buildings, the specific stillness of the city under military presence. Then a soldier entered the frame. A human, a young male, moving with a free gait the way soldiers move when they are in active contact. Present, but not on high alert. He was in full gear but carried his rifle low, on safety. Nothing charged. He reached the center of a wide open square and stopped. He looked at the drone. Velez watched with 11 minds. The soldier raised his hand. He waved. It wasn't a signal. Velez analyzed the gesture against 6 different databases of communication patterns: military signaling, territorial marking, challenge demonstration, gesture of submission, 17 categories of non-verbal combat communication that the Hegemony had cataloged for all known species. The gesture didn't match any of them. It was a raised, open hand, moving in a slow arc, directed at the drone, without a tactical goal that any of the 11 minds could identify. It was, as the analysis determined, recognition. The soldier was acknowledging that the drone was there, that the drone was observing, that the soldier knew he was being observed and wasn't accepting it, wasn't ignoring it, wasn't performing for it, just noting it the way you note the presence of another creature because that creature is there and present, and ignoring it would be a stranger choice. A soldier who had just stood in a city that his species had liberated in 19 days from a fleet that the Hegemony had for 4,000 years considered invincible. This soldier looked at the observation camera and waved hello. Velez watched the recording 11 times. On the 11th viewing, the 11th mind did something new, something no Velshar mind had done in any recorded moment of their history. It stopped, not the consensus, not the process. The mind itself stopped in the middle of viewing in the frame where the soldier's hand was raised, and it sat there, in the lattice of the other 10 minds, like a note sustained beyond its resolution, present, connected, but separate, not disagreeing, not objecting, just stopped. The other 10 minds waited. Consensus tried to form, but couldn't. The 11th mind found it, not in the recording, but in the archive, in the long, cold, crystalline shelves where 700 years of expansion records were kept, where the 3-1-year-old file lay, marked as low priority, only for monitoring, where the initial report on contact with a Class 3 developing species lay in a section for things not yet worth worrying about. The 11th mind found the note in the margin. 2 words, handwritten in an alphabet, the archivists labeled as unidentified and never investigated, because there was no reason to investigate margin notes on a first contact report of a species that was below the threshold. There was no reason until now. The 11th mind checked the alphabet against a database the other 10 hadn't thought to check. Not military intelligence, not galactic diplomatic records, but a linguistic archive compiled by a small research institute that cataloged endangered and minority languages of species across all known systems. The archive was 312 years old. It was compiled by a Velshar scientist whose specific interest lay in what languages could tell you about the species that spoke them. The alphabet was in the archive. The language was called Nganasan. It was spoken on Earth, specifically in a region called Timir, on the main continent of the planet. The archive listed it as a living language with approximately 90 million speakers, 90 million being a potential error, but we will preserve it, as in the original to preserve the scale, with regional and co-official status, historical significance, and a few notes on its grammatical structure and its tendency toward words that compressed complex states into single, precise expressions. The note in the margin read, "Hold back longer." Translation, "Hold back even more." The 11th mind held this in its separate stillness in the lattice. The other 10 minds waited. The translation was simple. The words were simple, but the 11th mind sat under their weight, specifically with the date of the first contact file, which was 31 years old, and the handwriting in the margin, which was small and neat and clearly internal. The kind of note you make for yourself, or for whoever comes after you, not for the people you are writing about. Someone was standing on Earth 31 years ago, before the hegemony established contact, before any formal relations existed between the two civilizations, before any warnings were filed or any development programs were active. Someone was standing there, knowing about what was watching from the sky, and wrote a reminder in the margin of the file. Hold back longer. Not a threat, not an announcement, but a reminder. The thing you write when you talk to yourself. When you maintain a discipline that requires active maintenance because the natural impulse is different. Hold back longer. The natural impulse, the thing they were holding back from, was not stated in the note. It wasn't required. You wrote, hold back longer, only if the longer was significant. If longer was something you were holding back longer than the observation had been happening. The 11th mind sat in the lattice for 3 seconds. In a Velshar consciousness, 3 seconds were equal to the cognitive work of a whole long lifetime. The other 10 minds felt the separation, not as a rupture, not as damage, but as a door that had always been theoretically possible, but never in 4,000 years had opened, and now was slightly ajar. The thought the 11th mind was forming was this. The hegemony, for 4,000 years, believed that the most dangerous thing when consolidating is a species that shows you everything it has. Those who don't try to hide their capabilities, who immediately apply full force, don't give you a window for assessment. This was wrong. The most dangerous thing when consolidating is a species that could show you everything, and for 31 years chose not to. Not because it was weak, not because it was afraid, but because it was making decisions. The 37 species the hegemony consumed never made decisions. They reacted, assessed, survived, did what living creatures do when force is applied to them. Earth was making a decision. For 31 years, Earth was deciding how much to show and when to show it, and what to do next. And the answer to the question of what to do next was obviously to evacuate its citizens, enter the code, and then send a soldier to stand in a city square and wave at a drone. 11 minds finally, with difficulty, reached a partial consensus. The partial consensus stated, we will develop terms of surrender and appeal to the Galactic Diet for a mediated settlement. The 11th mind rejoined the lattice, accepted the consensus, but kept the note. Hold back longer. It kept it the way you keep a thing that has changed the shape of what you thought you understood, not archived, not classified, just stored in the part of the mind where things live when they are too important to let go and too large to fully contain. The terms of the Hegemony's surrender began to take shape on the outside. The 31st Fleet Report lay in the archive next to the other 30, next to the first contact file that was 31 years old. The soldier on the recording still held his hand raised. The drone was still observing. The recognition was still being transmitted. Eva Salanova returned to the all-galactic diet on Thursday morning and sat in the same chair she had sat in for 12 years. The same chair, the same table, the same room with the ceiling that curved upward to make everyone feel equally small, which had stopped working on her in the 7th year, and which she had stopped thinking about in the 9th. The light still came from everywhere and cast no shadows. The air still calibrated every 8 minutes. The room was still full of representatives of species that breathed different things and sat in different poses and processed information, using architectures that had very little in common with each other. Except for one fact. All of them were here, in this room, waiting to hear what Earth wanted. She was 54 years old. She was 54 in about 6 months, and she still hadn't gotten used to it the way you sometimes had to get used to age. She looked the same as the last time she had sat in this chair. Gray hair, cautious face, the posture of a person who had long ago realized that how you hold your body in a room tells people something before you open your mouth, and decided to be intentional about what it said. She didn't look triumphant. She looked tired, not the tiredness that sleep fixes, but another one, the one that lives on the level below sleep. The one that was the result of carrying something heavy for so long that putting it down didn't immediately feel like relief. At first, it felt like the absence of a familiar weight. And the absence of a familiar weight, when that weight had been yours for 31 years, felt strange before it felt like anything else. She placed her folder on the table. She looked over the hall, 61 delegations, all the major powers, most minor ones, and a few species that had never before attended a full session and were here now. Because what had happened in 19 days was something that made species that had stayed in the shadows decide that they needed to know what happened next. Velez was in the center of the deliberative mass. The bioluminescence differed from the last time Eva had sat opposite it, an uneasy blue of full consensus. Something more complex colors for which she had no words in any of the languages she spoke, moving in patterns that were slower than usual and less synchronized. The 11 minds were not working in quite the perfect unison they had always demonstrated before. 3 weeks ago, she wouldn't have been able to read it. Now, she thought she understood it, at least partially. One of those minds was holding something it wasn't letting go of. She understood that feeling. The rest of the room had the quality of people who had performed calculations and were now waiting to hear if their calculations were correct. War games, peace settlements, that was what every intelligence service in the hall had been doing for the last 19 days. They looked at what Earth had demonstrated and asked what a species with such capabilities would want from a position of full victory. The answers were consistent in most assessments. Territory, the Torsus corridor and surrounding systems, probable resource concessions, mining rights, transit fees, priority access to corridors, mandatory defense treaties rewritten in Earth's favor, permanent military presence in key systems as a deterrent against future challenges, tribute payments calibrated to the scale of the collision, symbolic submissions, the kind that are recorded in history and mentioned centuries later. Whenever a species needed to explain why a certain power wasn't to be tested, it looked like a victory. That's how it always looked. 37 times in 4,000 years. That was the shape of things. After the stronger force had proven its point, Eva opened her folder. She read Earth's conditions. First condition, the surviving Lightens must be relocated to their original worlds with full restoration of sovereignty. Hegemony infrastructure built during the occupation must remain in place and functional, maintained at the Hegemony's expense for a minimum of 30 years, or until the Lightens determine they no longer need it. Earth will administer nothing. Earth will take nothing from Lighten space. Earth will not station troops there, will not establish observation points, will not demand treaty obligations from the Lightens in exchange for restoration. The Lightens will simply have their worlds back. The Sarvian delegate made a small sound, not a word, just the sound of a calculation being completed that gave an unexpected result. Second condition, the galactic arms reduction agreements are subject to revision, not change. Revision from the very beginning with an explicit requirement that every signatory disclose their actual military capabilities, not the capabilities they chose to present, not the capabilities that matched the existing treaty language, but real numbers. Every ship, every weapon type, including categories that had not previously been named in any treaty. Every development program. Earth will go first. Full disclosure, everything. After that, a longer silence followed. The silence that came not from shock, but from quick private recalculations of what full disclosure would mean for the species performing the recalculation. Several delegates exchanged glances with their aides. One delegation requested a brief pause for a meeting, which was granted and which Eva used to drink water and look at the ceiling with the expression of a person who had been in this room too many times to find the architecture impressive. Third condition. A new permanent bureau must be established within the structure of the Galactic Diet. Its name in the charter proposed by Earth was Bureau of Official Notification, or in the working language of the document, Office of Early Warning. Its function, as described, was simple. When a species filed an official warning with the Galactic Diet, someone from the Bureau of Official Notification had to read it, not just file it, not register it and assign it a reference number, but read it fully, including page 41. This condition caused the only moment in the session that was close to violating the room's formal atmosphere. Not laughter, something adjacent to it. A sound of recognition. Two delegates had to cover their mouths. One Chi representative looked at the table with an expression that in another context might be called embarrassed. Eva waited for them to calm down. She read the fourth condition. The fourth condition had no corresponding demand from Earth. The fourth condition was a list of 37 names. Names of species, system designations, dates of consolidation, and specific categories of what the hegemony owed each of them not to Earth, not through Earth's administration, and not managed by any Earth-affiliated body. It was to be paid directly, settled directly. Restoration of resources, restoration of infrastructure, documentation of sovereignty, economic compensation calculated by methodology. The document detailed it on 11 pages. 37 species, 37 sets of conditions, 37 different forms of debt. Earth compiled the list, Earth performed the calculations, Earth collected none of it. The hall was quiet, just as it had been quiet when Eva read the third warning aloud. Not the polite silence of waiting people, but the silence that happens when sentient beings simultaneously reach the same point and need a moment before the next action. Veles broke it. The 11 minds moved through their patterns slower than 4 weeks ago, less synchronously, but moved, striving for the consensus that was the Velshar way of interacting with a situation. The bioluminescence pulsed in several colors Eva couldn't name before stabilizing in something that was neither the uncertain blue of before nor anything else she had a reference for. Veles asked in translation what Earth wanted in return. Not from the hegemony, not specifically, but in return for everything. For 19 days, for 31 fleets, for the third warning that was read aloud, and for 2 words in the margin, and for the dark ships with no names in the treaties, and for all of this, what was the shape of what Earth wanted on the other side? Eva looked at Veles. She held that gaze for a moment, not performing it, not letting it mean more than it meant, just looking. That's how you look at something when you want to remember it precisely later. To go home, she said, and not return. The session continued. Procedural responses were filed. Working groups were appointed to solve logistical issues. Restoration of the Lighten Pact, revision of agreements, creation of a new office. Official acceptance by the hegemony and the conditions was recorded in the official transcript with correct reference numbers and appropriate signatures. Everything that needed to happen for the protocol happened. Eva answered questions. She clarified condition language where delegates asked for explanations. She was patient the way she had always been patient. Not warm, not cold, just present, doing the work. She was almost finished. She was almost at the part where she would take her folder and leave for the last time and take a transport home, and sleep for about 3 days before her aide would start adding matters to her calendar again. Then the smallest delegation in the hall stood up. They were called the Nthani, 3 representatives of a species that had been accepted into the Galactic Diet 9 years ago and had spent most of those 9 years being very cautious and very quiet, watching the major powers with the patient attention of a species that understood exactly what it was and what it wasn't, and had come to terms with it. They had 2 small worlds in a system no one particularly wanted. They had watched the 19 days, as minor species watch what happens between major ones, carefully from the sidelines, taking very good notes. One of their representatives, young, judging by appearance, though Eva never learned to precisely identify age in Thani, had been reading the full disclosure documents since their submission by Eva, and at the start of the session, the ones Earth promised to provide first. The real numbers. Each program, each category, each ship, each capability that had been built in unnamed categories for 20 years and kept out of all treaty talks and all disclosures until now. The young representative looked up from the documents. He looked at Eva. He said in a translation that was cautious and slow, because the translation system was still adding to its Nthani vocabulary. "You had this. How long?" The hall heard it. Everyone heard it. The question hung in the air of the chamber with the special weight of a question that many in the hall hadn't asked, and hearing it aloud made it real in a different way. Eva looked at the young representative. She saw what she recognized. Not fear, but something near fear, the thing that happens when a creature first realizes that the space it had been occupying was much closer to something very large and very restrained than it had known. The way you feel when you learn that something quietly sitting in the corner of a room you had been in for years wasn't a piece of furniture. She didn't look away. "Long enough," she said. The young representative looked at the documents again, looked up again. "Why didn't you?" "Because we didn't want to," Eva said. She said it simply, not as a performance, not with the weight of a prepared phrase, just words in the order that made them the truth. That's the whole point. No one believed that. "We still don't want to." She took her folder, she closed it. The room didn't make the sound that rooms usually made when a session ended. Movement, gathering, and the low murmur of people moving to the next. She remained for a moment before that, the moment when something had been said, and the air was still holding it. Eva allowed it to hold. Then she stood up, tucked the folder under her arm, and left the all-galactic diet for the last time. The news feeds relayed it in general terms correctly, which was more than they usually could. Denis Okonyev was reading the inscription on the transit platform at Station Ladoga while eating something that smelled vaguely, incorrectly, but was delicious, and had been bought from a vendor whose name he didn't catch and couldn't pronounce if he had. He was in civilian clothes. He had been in civilian clothes for 3 days and was still making small adjustments that came from being in uniform for too long. Stood a little too straight, turned to check corners out of habit, held his duffel bag close, though it contained nothing worth guarding. The inscription ran behind him on the station display. Galactic Diet ratifies agreement on full disclosure of human capabilities, shocks delegates. 3 days, 3 ambassadors negotiated. Restoration of sovereignty. Litan unconditional. Hegemony accepts all conditions. He read it while eating. His grandmother had called him 4 times since he landed. He had answered twice. Both times she asked him 3 questions, and he answered all 3 incorrectly, and she made a sound, a specific exhale, somewhere between a sigh and something with less patience. It meant she knew and for now had decided not to insist. She was going to insist. Eventually, she was going to insist when he walked in her door empty-handed, because he had left Station Ladoga 11 months ago with her beads on his wrist, and he was returning without them, and she would notice that before he finished taking off his boots. He had given them to a child, a Litan child in the refugee camp on Oshara. Not the one from the doorway in Ati, but a small one who sat by the fence on the edge of the camp perimeter and watched Earth's soldiers with that huge, complex, motionless stare that Litan children had when they were trying to understand something. Deo crouched down to be at the child's level, and the child looked at the beads on his wrist, and then he took them off and held them out, and the child took them with both hands very carefully. That's how you take something when you understand it had belonged to someone a long time ago. He didn't tell his grandmother about this. He would have to explain it to his grandmother. He thought about how to explain it so it would be received correctly. He could explain that it was a gift, which was the truth. He could explain that the child needed something solid to hold, which was also the truth. He could explain that there are things that pass through hands and keep moving, and that this was the right direction for them, which was the truest thing, but also what his grandmother would find most suspicious coming from him, because it sounded too much like what a person says when trying to make a decision look like wisdom in hindsight. He finished eating. The transit platform was full of the usual noise of a station that hadn't stopped working for the 19 days of events that had taken place very far away. Children argued with parents, vendors shouted their wares, the special acoustics of a large enclosed space, absorbing the sound of many people passing through it. At Station Ladoga, there was an observation deck on the upper level where his grandmother usually stood and watched the ships in the transit corridor, waving at them the way she waved at things freely, openly, signaling nothing, just noting the presence of another moving object in the world and acknowledging it. He thought about that gesture. He thought about the observation drone slowly describing circles above the square in the city that smelled of ozone and something sweet, and about the hand raised without any decision, and what it meant to acknowledge the presence of someone watching you when you stood together, where that observation had been directed for 31 years. He didn't have a finished thought about it. He wasn't sure it was the kind of thing that resolves into a finished thought. It was more like something you carry, not heavy, not light, just present. Like some things are present after they've happened. Like the beads were on his wrist and are now somewhere else, in other hands, still held. The transit announcement sounded from the platform loudspeakers. His route, departure time, the familiar cadence of a station that had announced routes since he was born, and would announce them after. He took his bag. He thought, well, that's enough. Not a grand thought, not a thought that reflected the scale of what had happened in 19 days or 31 years or 4,000 years of a species, holding back what it didn't want to use and being understood as weak because of it. Not a thought that paid tribute to 340 ships, or the child in the doorway, or a pair of beads moving from one hand to another in the morning light of a world that smelled strange and was learning to breathe again. Just a thought. Small, real, sufficient thought. He got on the transport. He went home. Outside, above the station, the sky over Novosibirsk was exactly that color, the special blue color of the planet that was his and had always been his. And it would be there when he returned from any place they sent him next, which they would do, because they always did. And he would go, because he always had. And the beads by then would be somewhere else, and he would find something else to hold. And that would be enough. That had always been enough. In the end, that was what the galaxy didn't believe. Not in ships, not in weapons with no names in treaties, not in dark capabilities built in the gaps of language no one had thought to close. What they didn't believe was simpler than all of that. Earth had enough. It had always had enough. It never required more. It held back for 31 years, not because it was afraid to lose, but because it understood on a level deep enough to write it in the margin of a file, pass it forward, and trust the next person, that possessing power, taking something, and choosing not to do it, that is the only kind of power that means anything. Hold back longer. The transport moved. The city remained behind. The sky remained exactly that color all the way home.